Welcome back, everyone, to the Hero of Pages. I am the book channel prophesied to save the world from reading slumps or something like that. Today, I'm going to talk about books I've been reading, books I'm currently reading, and what's up next. I finished a few books in the past couple of weeks. I feel really proud of that. I would love to be one of those book people on the internet who reads 100 books a year or more. I don't have that level of capability, both in terms of focus, but also in terms of life circumstances. Maybe I could. I don't know. I think I'm too distracted by multiple hobbies, but I'm trying to read more than usual. So generally, I get through anywhere between 25 and 50 books a year, and it really kind of depends. But I'm going to try and hit the 50 books in a year mark. I would love to be reading at least a novel a week if possible. So that's kind of what I'm going for. I finished two books in the past week and a half, 2 weeks. The first book I finished is by Blake Crouch. It's a book called Recursion. This is pretty popular at this point. Blake Crouch is a very well-known author. If you haven't heard of him, check him out. He's one of the better kind of sci-fi writers today, particularly within the genre of near future like sci-fi thriller. He kind of feels a bit like Michael Crichton in that way. It's not sci-fi. What I've read of him so far is not the type of sci-fi where you're going off deep into space thousands of years in the future, but much more on Earth now or within the next couple of decades, dealing with technology that's changing how humanity behaves or acts. Recursion is really cool. I don't want to give too much away. It's a thriller with a lot of twists in it, but it plays with this idea of kind of reliving memories, like a recursion, a recursive memory that you kind of can go back into. There's more to it than that, so I'll leave that for the book. But this book's a quick read. I think it's not very long. You can kind of see here. It's 250, 300 pages, something like that. And you'll just breeze right through it. The characters are pretty good. It's very much written like a thriller, so it's very fast paced, keeps the pages turning. You don't necessarily spend a ton of time with any of the specific characters, but Blake Crouch does a good job of connecting you with the characters enough to care. And so the primary characters you meet, I think you will develop fondness for, and you will be invested in them figuring out how to get out of this problem based on a technology that's messing with memory. So check out Recursion. Highly recommend it. Yeah, if you've read Recursion, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know Blake Crouch has a new book that's coming out called Upgrade, I think. And I believe that it's either coming out this week or it just came out last week. But I'll be picking that up fairly soon as well, because I've now read Recursion and Dark Matter, which I think are his two most acclaimed books, and they were both phenomenal. I liked them both about the same. Dark Matter and Recursion are both great. And I've heard good things about his other novels as well. I plan to work my way through Blake's back catalog. I'm calling him Blake like him and I are friends. We're not, but he wants to be. Let me know. I'll be your friend, Blake. Yeah, I plan to read through, I think next up will be Upgrade, since that just came out. And then I'll probably go back and read either the Wayward Pines trilogy, and he has another novel that's called, I think it's called Abandoned. So I'll have to check those out sometime soon. I highly recommend Recursion. Maybe I'll do a little bit more in-depth of a review of the book where I go into spoilers and talk about specific events that happen in the novel. So if you'd like that, let me know in the comments, and I'll decide whether or not to prioritize that. But it was a great read. The next book I actually just finished the other day, and that is a fantasy book called The Ember Blade. This is a novel by Chris Wooding. It's fairly long. I think it's like 800, a little over 800 pages, but it reads fairly quickly. I've been very impressed with Chris's ability to craft a story. In my book haul video that I released where I picked up this book, I mentioned that the cover of this book looks maybe a touch generic. And I think that's true. It's nice art, but it's a little generic. And something about the book called to me in the bookstore, and I picked it up. And I'm glad I did, because even though it called to me, I thought this is probably going to be a somewhat generic fantasy story. The back blurb was cool, but a little generic. The first chapter was interesting, but it didn't blow me away. But something about the overall mix of this book seemed like it was worth picking up. As I continued to read, got further into the book, I just became more and more impressed as characters who I started out liking took on a lot more dimensionality. The characters in this book have a lot of different facets to them. And it it's not as black and white as it initially seems. It very much plays with the tropes of an epic classic fantasy, kind of a high slash epic fantasy quest, a group of people trying to overcome an oppressive evil force with a fantasy relic or MacGuffin. In this case, the Ember Blade itself. It's the book's namesake is kind of the goal of this quest is to retrieve this artifact that is going to help a people of this nation called Ossia to fight back their oppressors, the Crodans, who have conquered in previous decades and overtaken the land. And at first, it felt like it was going to be very much what you'd expect. And in some way, it was. But I think this book did a great job of taking a lot of beloved classic fantasy tropes and twisting them just enough and doing just enough different things with them that it felt really refreshing. It wasn't quite to the level of, say, Brandon Sanderson in terms of fully subverting a magic system, or something like China Mieville, where it's just very weird and bizarre and out there. But it did enough to subvert and play with tropes in a way that made it a surprising and enjoyable read. There were things that happened in this book that I didn't expect to happen. There were things I expected to happen, but they unfolded a little bit differently than I thought that they were going to, in a way that felt satisfying. I felt like the promises made were paid off very well, and yet it still was surprising and delightful. So definitely check out the Ember Blade. I think it's going to be one of my favorite reads of the year. It took me back to a place as a kid, the cozy feeling of this grand epic fantasy with a bunch of characters I love in a world that is filled with wonder, but also a little bit of awe and terror, with some oppressive forces that are hunting them and trying to prevent them from ultimately achieving the goal of their quest. So I'm definitely going to do a review of this because I think it absolutely deserves that. This book hasn't gotten as much attention as I expected. Now that I've read the book, I went and searched for some reviews because I hadn't heard anything about it, which was surprising because I'm pretty clued into like Reddit and TikTok and YouTube in terms of what's coming out in fantasy. I know most of the stuff that's out or coming out. This does have a little bit of attention, especially a year or 2 years ago. There are a few more notable, like mildly notable folks who've reviewed it. I even think some of the bigger booktubers may have reviewed this, but I haven't heard a lot about it, and I feel like it deserves more attention. So check out The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. Great story, awesome, immersive world. He does a great job pulling you in and making you feel like you are in this world with these characters. And then a lot of great characters, many of whom you'll love, several of whom you'll hate, and all of whom are a lot more complex and have more shades of gray than you may initially think as you first pick up this novel. So very excited to have finished that. Let's get into what I'm currently reading. A couple days ago, I picked up, last book haul, I picked up a book called The Troop by Nick Cutter. And he is a horror author. He has several fairly well-known books at this point. Found out about Nick Cutter from TikTok. I can't remember whose account it was, but I was drawn to kind of the body horror element mixed with Lord of the Flies. So The Troop is following a group of kids who are kind of on a Boy Scouts retreat to an island off the shore of like Nova Scotia or just off the shore of Canada, like way up in the northeast. And they're on this small island with their scoutmaster, and a man arrives on the island in a boat, and something's off about him. He seems sickly, he's acting weird, and he's voraciously hungry, which is unsettling in its own right. That's a weird mix of things to happen. These kids are in this remote location. The scoutmaster is the only adult there other than this guy who's arrived. And it seems like this book is very much going to be playing with some type of disease or contagion related to making people wildly, unnaturally hungry. Maybe there's some kind of parasitic element to this. And from what I've heard, there's a lot of body horror elements. And what I've read so far, I've read about a third of the book. There are some pretty unsettling, disturbing things that happen. I'm a little bit squeamish, honestly, and this is getting to me a bit, but in a good way, right? Like sometimes when I read, I want to ruin my day through the magic of words. And this book is doing that. So if you want to read a horror book about a group of kids, kind of Lord of the Flies-esque, who are stranded on an island, but also dealing with some horrible, horrible contagion, I'd give this a try. I've also been impressed with some of the character work in this book too. He does a good job filling in the motivations of some of these different kids and helping you understand a bit more about who they are and who their parents are and their dynamic, to then explain how they interact with each other, especially when they're secluded on a small island, kind of cut off from the rest of the mainland. So check out The Troop. It's pretty good. I'm hoping to finish this in the next couple of days. Like I said, it's not super long. I'm about a third of the way through. So hopefully I'll be able to maybe put out a review for this sometime in the next week or so as well. I'm also reading Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. If you don't know who I'm just kidding. Everyone knows who Brandon Sanderson is. This is his young adult space opera novel that follows a character named Spensa who wants to be a pilot desperately. Humanity is contained to an alien planet called Detritus. I can never remember how to properly pronounce that word. So if I got it wrong, you can correct me. Actually, correct me if I'm wrong and write in the comments, because that's engagement. That's good from what I hear. Anyway, humanity is contained to this planet Detritus, and there's an alien force called the Krell that sends ships trying to wipe them out. And a small force of humanity become starship pilots to push back this invading force. So it's pretty cool. Very much sci-fi space opera vibes, Star Wars, young protagonist in a spaceship, less mystical than Star Wars. You know, it's not quite as much like Jedi type stuff, but much more in the flying ships and things like that. Starsight's the second book, and there are some twists and turns that this series takes. Brandon Sanderson, as always, is known for his twists and turns, for the Sanderlanche at the end of each of his novels, where things unwind and you're like, oh, that's what was happening all along. So I don't really want to say a whole lot about the second novel in a generic update because it's probably going to give some spoilers, but it's good. YA isn't my default subgenre to go towards. I tend to stick a little bit more in adult fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, but I do occasionally like YA, and this has been a really nice YA book. And I think it's written in a way that it's a quality story, but it's a bit more accessible in its language. And I think it's really great. I think it's worth checking out. If you like dogfights and spaceships, if you like weird alien races, and a mystery behind what happened with humanity in the past and how they've interacted with some of the other alien races that are now known in the universe. If that type of thing sounds good and you like Brandon Sanderson's action and plot twists and character work, or if you've never read Sanderson but you like good action and you like satisfying plot twists and you like fun, relatively relatable, quirky characters, Sanderson does all of that well. So check it out. I'm enjoying it. I'm reading it on Kindle actually, so I don't have a bookmark in the physical book. Generally, I'll read one physical novel and one book on Kindle at the same time. More than that gets to be a bit tricky to juggle. But so I'm reading that on Kindle. I'm a little over halfway at this point, so I'm hoping to wrap that up in the next week or two. I'm going a little slower on this book because I don't read on my Kindle quite as often. So I'll read on it a little bit before bed and I fall asleep quickly. So, but hoping to get through that so that I can eventually start the third novel, Cytonic. All right. So that's what I'm currently reading. Next, let's talk for a minute about what I will be reading over the next couple of weeks, maybe sooner. I always like to think I'll read faster than I do. After I finish The Troop and Starsight, I'm actually going to take a break before I start the third book in the Starsight series, or in the Skyward series, the third book, Cytonic. I think I'm going to take a break and reread Leviathan Wakes, which is the first novel in the Expanse series. This is also pretty well known. Now that all 9 books are out, I've been wanting to read this full series. I've heard great things about it. I enjoyed the first season of the show. I enjoyed the first book when I read it 5 years ago. I actually just got my dad to read it. He just finished it recently, and so I want to try and keep up with him so him and I can be talking about this series. But I plan to start Leviathan Wakes on my Kindle as soon as I finish Starsight. So I'm excited about that. And then finally, the next physical volume I want to read after finishing The Troop, I'm going to take a break from horror, and I'm actually going to take a break from written fantasy. And I'm going to pick up the first volume of Berserk. So this is a manga series. This is also something I imagine pretty much anyone who stumbles across this video will be familiar with. If on the offhand chance you're not, Berserk is a manga series that has been running for, I don't know how many years, but quite a long time, for 10, 15 years. You can tell me the exact amount in the comments if you know. It's a dark fantasy story. The protagonist is a guy named Guts, and he has this gigantic two-handed sword, kind of like Final Fantasy VII, and he is fighting all sorts of horrible monsters and demonic type creatures. And I don't know a whole lot more than that. I've seen some of the art. I've read the first couple of pages. The artwork's incredible. It gives very strong Dark Souls type vibes. If you've ever played any of the From Software games like Dark Souls or Bloodborne or Elden Ring, it feels like a comic book version of that type of world, which is cool because ever since I played Dark Souls 3 years ago for the first time, there was something about that dark, mournful, melancholy fantasy world that I loved, that I wanted to be captured in fantasy like literature format. I haven't necessarily found anything in novel form that quite hits all those notes the same way that Dark Souls does, but I've heard Berserk is pretty close, and the artwork I've seen feels like it. So I will be starting the first omnibus of Berserk. I'm forgetting, I think the first arc is called The Black Swordsman. I'll double check that. If it's wrong, I'll correct it here. You can also drop a comment. But I'm excited about this. I've heard great things. This is all the rage on the internet right now anyway. I picked up the first volume or two of this like a year plus ago, and I keep putting it off. And Barnes and Noble recently had a sale that was buy one get one 50% off any hardcover in the store, which included their manga volumes. So I picked up a couple more of those. You can see that in my book haul. So I'm going to be trying to do maybe one volume of Berserk every month or so throughout this year, and I guess into next year. There's a lot of them. But I want to make progress on this story. I really do like manga and comics as a format, but my favorite is still written word. So I'll probably kind of intersperse those. I'd also like to get to some of the other big manga series like Vinland Saga. There's also 20th Century Boys is one that I've actually read the first omnibus of that, and I really liked it. So I'd like to get back to that and read more 20th Century Boys, which is by the same author who wrote Monster, that I've heard great things about Monster as well. So I have some other manga stuff I would like to be getting to, but for now, I think I'm going to pick up Berserk because it's all the rage, and I am heavily influenced by everything I see on the internet. That's what I'm reading, and what I'm going to be reading over the next couple of weeks here. Before we wrap up the video, I just wanted to touch on video games that I've been playing recently. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I just finished Elden Ring. I picked up this really cool Steelbook edition when the game came out. It's, I don't know, it's actually steel, but it's like this nice metal case that looks really good. I've been playing this game since it came out in late February, and it's one of the best games I've ever played, hands down. I'm historically not very good at Souls games. I never beat Dark Souls 3 when I tried it like 6 years ago. I fell in love with the world and the tone of that game, but I was at the time, I guess, either too bad at video games or too lazy to really push through it. When Elden Ring came out, I decided I really want to finish this game and see if maybe these games can be for me, because I love the settings that they're in. I was blown away by Elden Ring. It's a hard game, like any From Software game, but it's not impossible. Mostly it just requires you to learn how to play the game, learn the patterns of the enemies and the bosses you're fighting. You really have to pay attention to what you're doing, but it doesn't take like a rocket scientist to figure it out. It's mostly, when should I be dodging? What types of attacks does this boss have? You can learn all of these things. You just have to spend a little bit of time, and you got to take your time through these games. They're hard to rush through especially if you're new to these more difficult Souls-like games. It was a blast. I put like 110 hours into this thing. It's a very big game, but it's one of the coolest fantasy worlds I've experienced, and very well realized. It's this giant continent called the Lands Between, and there's a bunch of different biomes, and there's mountaintops and underground cities, and there are, I don't want to spoil it even, because there's so many cool things that you just stumble across, but it's really neat. Also worth noting that George R.R. Martin helped write a lot of the world lore and kind of the background setting of Elden Ring. So there are some cool courtly politics and things that are part of the storyline as you play the game. If you like video games, if any of that sounds interesting to you, I 100% recommend picking up Elden Ring. It's one of my favorite games ever, probably in the top 3. If you love, dark fantasy, that type of thing, you should really check this out. So now that I finished Elden Ring, I'm going to be picking up Dark Souls 3 and playing that, because I love these types of worlds. And now that I've gotten a little bit more familiar with the FromSoft equation, I think I'm up for the challenge of trying to beat that game this time around. So I'll be playing Dark Souls 3 here and there when I get some time. One other video game I've been playing recently, I picked up on Switch, and this is Hades, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're trying to escape the realm of Hades. It's a Greek god pantheon. You're the son of Hades. He doesn't want you to escape his lair, and you're a rebellious teenager. Essentially, you're trying to escape the land of the dead. What's cool is this game is a roguelike, which is not my normal genre. What a roguelike is if you die, you start at the beginning every time. You have to beat the entire game in one go. But usually the way these games work is as you play them, you unlock abilities and things that help you become more powerful and be able to progress more easily through the duration of the game. And that's what this is. But I think what sets it apart is the quality of the writing in the world is so wonderful. So you try and escape, you die, you spawn back in your bedroom in the realm of Hades, and then you go out into the palace of Hades and talk to him, and he kind of scolds you for trying to escape and tells you you're making him look bad. And there's other fallen heroes like Achilles, who's hanging out in Hades' lair. And you can talk to him, or to Nyx, or there's all these characters that you meet who are in the pantheon. And as you progress and try and beat this game, they're dynamic and they change. And so their interactions will change with you. And if you make it to the first big boss and you die, you go back to the beginning. Some of the characters will mention, oh, you made it all the way to this character. That's, nice work. And it's just a really cool and immersive feel to the game. It makes you feel like you're part of the Greek pantheon, and the writing and dialogue of the characters is great, and the gameplay is really fun. It's great combat. Well, thanks for joining. That wraps up this week in the things that I've read, I'm reading, video games I'm playing. That is this week's Fantasy Quest. I would love to hear from you. What are you reading right now? What books have you finished? What are you excited about? Please drop comments if you have anything that you're interested in. I'm always looking for new ideas as well. And if you liked this video, consider liking and subscribing and all the usual stuff. Tune back in next week for another Fantasy Quest, as well as for other videos like book hauls, book reviews, things like that. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.